opening statement of the defendant. Go ahead, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Counsel. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, before I begin my opening statement, I'd like to remind you all of the instructions that you've all already indicated you're willing to follow, particularly the instruction that tells you that Kelsie Thomas, as she sits here today, is innocent until she's proven guilty. Now, as for defense team, our position is that the state will never be able to prove that she is guilty in your eyes, and that's your decision to make. But what I'm talking about is her presumption of innocence that you folks need to have right now, because that's important. And I don't normally point that out in cases, but I am in this case because of the allegations in this case. And the allegations are horrible. And we can all recognize how quickly a reasonable person could look at these set of facts and make up their mind prematurely. The risk you folks have in doing so is that you're presuming guilt and not presuming innocence. And in doing that, you may in fact find an innocent person guilty. So before I begin to tell you what I believe is a fair preview of what you're going to hear, keep that in mind. As my client sits here today, she is innocent until proven guilty. Keep that in mind when you hear about all the things that Kelsie Thomas went through the day and in the aftermath of her daughter's death. And this is going to be difficult because Cloe Chandler was a beautiful little 5-year-old girl. We want justice for Cloe Chandler. But if we presume guilt, that's not justice. And the reality is that there's substantial evidence to establish that Cloe Chandler, in fact, died of a tragic accident on that day. And that ultimately, Kelsie Thomas, through days of hard questioning and interrogation, confessed in a way that should leave you folks trouble with how the facts actually line up with this final story as well. And it's, again, that confession piece that's so hard to get past, right? Well, as we discussed in voir dire, false confessions are a real-life thing. And in this case, you folks are going to hear from Dr. Brian Cutler, who is an expert on interrogation and false confessions. Brian Cutler is going to tell you about how he reviewed the interrogation of Kelsie Thomas. He's going to tell you about the many known risk factors for false confession that existed during that interrogation. Dr. Cutler will testify that while he can't tell you if Kelsie Thomas is telling the truth, because nobody can tell you if Kelsie Thomas was actually telling the truth, he'll testify that in his expert opinion, that interrogation created an environment which would encourage both an innocent and guilty person to confess. You'll hear Dr. Cutler quantify the number of many different tactics that were utilized in the interrogation of Kelsie Thomas. You'll hear him testify about the known purposes that investigators know in employing these tactics. In voir dire, ladies and gentlemen, he indicated that the circumstances, the context of Kelsie Thomas's confession would be important for you to know. And Dr. Brian Cutler is going to give you a lot of that context. And context is important. I think both sides agree on that. And because context is important, it'd be important for you folks to know that the evidence will show that when Kelsie Thomas, moments after finding her daughter, called 911, she told the 911 operator what she saw. And then moments after the chaplain at the hospital announced Chloe's death, Kelsie Thomas was whisked away into a private room by another member of law enforcement and asked again what had happened. In the next coming days, the evidence will show, in fact, the next day, that she voluntarily conducted a video walkthrough with the police at their request. You'll learn that her so-called close cousin, Brittany Johnson, volunteered to surveil and monitor her with no results. And the evidence will show that Kelsie Thomas completely cooperated with every aspect of the police investigation, all the way leading up to her confession. The evidence will show that from the moment she dialed 911, through numerous conversations, through all of this interrogation, her story remained the same until the very end. And all of this, imagine losing your daughter, and then this is what you face. All within a week of losing Cloe. And these pajama pants that you just overheard the state indicate. Kelsie confessed that she strangled Cloe with. You're going to find that throughout those hours and hours and hours of interrogation, I'm estimating maybe 10 or 12 hours of interrogation, investigators were telling Kelsie Thomas, it is impossible. The science tells us those pajama pants could not have made those marks. And so you have to ask yourself, how is it that after hours and hours of telling Kelsie Thomas that these pajama pants could not have created these marks and could not have been the cause of Cloe Chandler's death, then the investigators decide, okay, we'll go ahead and accept that as long as you're confessing. The pajama pants must have done it, after all. Isn't that interesting? And ask yourselves, folks, does the final version of events make sense? Does it logically make sense? And while you might consider the so-called confession of Kelsie Thomas the state's biggest piece of evidence, as the state indicated, you're also going to hear from the state's associate medical examiner, Michelle Cavalier, who will testify that in her opinion, Cloe Chandler died of strangulation. And there are a couple things that the defense would like to preview for you folks on this topic. First of all, Dr. Michelle Cavalier did not come to that conclusion at the end of her autopsy. Dr. Michelle Cavalier did not come to that conclusion until after she had learned that Kelsie Thomas confessed. It was then that she made her finding of strangulation. And if that confession, if in your minds, is not valid, if it's not good, and that was the basis of Dr. Cavalier's opinion, then that really calls into question everything about the state's case. Another thing I'd like you to keep in mind, folks, is that you're also going to hear from a man named Dr. Thomas Young. And he's the former chief medical examiner of Jackson County, Missouri in Kansas City. He's got a lot of other great credentials. And you're going to hear him testify about how he so substantially disagrees with Dr. Cavalier's findings. Not her findings, her opinion. You'll hear that Dr. Young is adopting all of her autopsy findings. He's not disagreeing with what she physically saw, just her opinion based on what she saw. And he's going to give you all the reasons that support his opinion. He will testify that the findings at autopsy, in his medical opinion, were consistent with his case history, including Kelsie Thomas's initial events. Dr. Young will testify that the findings were consistent with what Kelsie Thomas said all along. Context is important. As far as any family members that you will hear about that were suspicious of Kelsie, would it be important for you to know how close or not close these individuals were to Kelsie and her family? Would it be important for you to know whether or not closer family members, like her husband or her father, that she would see on a daily basis, would agree with those opinions? Where did the state get these people? Did investigators take into account the concerns or non-concerns of people that were actually involved in Kelsie's life? And what if, ladies and gentlemen, all of these dynamics that the state will argue to you demonstrate that Kelsie Thomas is guilty are in fact twisted in a weird way that causes the value of each to be diminished in some way? Contamination. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my client, Kelsie Thomas. Prior to her life being completely destroyed by her daughter's death and its aftermath, Kelsie was a young married woman, mother of Cloe Chandler, age 5, Phoenix Thomas, age 2. Her husband worked up by the airport at Plastipack. She was cooking your pizzas at Casey's General Store. There are Kelsie Thomases in our town and everywhere across this country that, due to their life circumstances, would be an easy target for assumptions. And this is what happened in this case. Any parent unfortunate enough to find their child in the circumstances that Kelsie Thomas found and could not explain would find themselves in Kelsie's position now. And just like the prospective juror that we discussed in voir dire, when she was asked, well, do you remember your wedding? Well, I remember getting married. I don't remember all the details. On July 19, 2018, Kelsie Thomas knows it was burned in her brain. She found her daughter hanging that day. She can't quite explain how she got her down. The fact that she couldn't explain it started all this. And think of the source, as she's the only witness. If this were all just a scheme on the part of Kelsie Thomas, why would she just not tell a different story? Ladies and gentlemen, on July 19, 2018, Cloe Chandler tragically died by an accidental ending. The state will not be able to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that it happened any other way. And because of that, at the close of all the evidence, not just the state's evidence, but all the evidence, I'll get back up here and I'll ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.